For years. That was how long Isabella Moretti had been living inside a house that looked perfect from the street and felt like a coffin from the inside. From the outside, the Whitmore brownstone in Boston's Back Bay was a picture of respectability. Ivy climbing the red brick, a polished brass knocker, window boxes overflowing with white hydrangeas that Isabella herself watered every morning at 5 a.m. before the sun came up. Neighbors waved. The mailman smiled. The pastor at St. Cecilia's shook Roland Whitmore's hand every Sunday and called him a pillar of the community. Nobody, not a single soul on that quiet tree-lined street, knew that behind the heavy oak door, a 24-year-old woman was learning every night how to swallow her own screams so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Heartbreak hits hardest when it wears the face of family, and cruelty, Isabella had learned, was quietest inside the homes that looked the most beautiful. She stood at the bathroom mirror on that particular Thursday night, the fluorescent light buzzing softly overhead, and stared at the fresh bloom of purple spreading across her ribs. She had learned the geography of her own bruises the way other women learned the geography of their favorite cities. This one low on her left side was 3 days old. The one on her upper arm, hidden beneath the sleeve of her cream cardigan, was from Tuesday. The faint yellow crescent along her jawline was already fading, which was a small mercy, because she was scheduled to work the morning shift at Rossetti's bakery, and Mrs. Rossetti had started asking questions. Isabella pressed her fingers gently against the tender skin and let out a slow, shaking breath. She was a beautiful woman, and once, before the darkness had swallowed her whole, she had known it. She had lush, generous curves that filled out her clothes the way a woman's body was meant to. Long, dark hair the color of wet earth. Warm brown eyes that used to sparkle when she laughed. She was plus size, unapologetically so, and her late mother, God rest her, had taught her since she was a little girl that a woman's worth was never measured by the number on a scale. Her mother had called her Bella Mia, my beautiful one. Her mother had promised her the whole world. Her mother had been dead for 4 years. Elena Moretti had died on a rain-slicked highway outside Boston on a Tuesday night in October, driving home from her nursing shift at Mass General. A drunk driver in a pickup truck had crossed the center line. Isabella had been 20 years old, home from her first semester at Boston University, when the state trooper knocked on the door. Roland Whitmore, her mother's second husband of only 14 months, had answered that door with tears in his eyes and a comforting arm around Isabella's shoulders. He had played the grieving widower flawlessly through the funeral. He had held Isabella's hand at the graveside. He had told her they were family now. He had told her he would take care of her. 2 weeks after the funeral, he had burned her Boston University acceptance letter for the spring semester in the kitchen sink and told her she wasn't going anywhere. And when she had cried, when she had begged, when she had said her mother had wanted her to finish school, Roland Whitmore had backhanded her across the face so hard she saw white light. That was the first bruise. It had bloomed on her cheekbone like a dark flower, and Isabella had covered it with her mother's old concealer, and she had learned in that single moment that the man her mother had married was not the man her mother had thought he was. Before we go any further into Isabella's story tonight, do me one small favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your city in the comments so I know exactly where in the world you're listening from tonight. It means everything. Now, back to that Thursday night. Isabella lowered her cardigan carefully back over her shoulder, wincing as the soft fabric brushed the bruise. She washed her hands. She smoothed her hair. She practiced the small polite smile she wore like armor whenever Roland was home. Then she patted quietly down the carpeted hallway toward the kitchen, because Roland liked his dinner on the table at 7 sharp, and it was already 6:52, and Isabella had learned in 4 brutal years exactly what happened when Roland's dinner was late. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and roasted lamb. Isabella had spent 2 hours preparing it exactly the way he liked. She was setting the crystal water glass beside his plate when she heard his key in the front door, and every muscle in her body went still. Roland Whitmore stepped into the foyer, shook the October rain off his cashmere overcoat, and hung it precisely on the 3rd hook of the coat rack. Everything about Roland was precise. 52 years old. silver at the temples. A jawline kept sharp by tennis at the country club 3 mornings a week. He wore a navy suit tailored in London, a wristwatch worth more than Isabella made in a year, and a wedding ring he had never taken off, even after Elena had been dead for 4 Octobers. To the outside world, he was a grieving widower who had generously taken in his beloved late wife's daughter. To Isabella, he was the wolf who had eaten her mother's memory piece by piece. "Isabella," he called out, his voice pleasant, almost warm. That was how he always sounded when he first came home. Pleasant, measured, like a man in a commercial for expensive whiskey. It was the voice that had fooled her mother. It was the voice that fooled the neighbors. And Isabella, even after 4 years, still felt her stomach clench at the sound of it, because she never knew which Roland was walking through the door, the pleasant one or the other one. "In the kitchen," she called back, forcing her voice to sound light. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, loosening his tie with 2 efficient fingers. His pale blue eyes moved over the dining table, the lamb, the roasted potatoes, the water glass at the correct angle, the folded linen napkin. And he gave a small approving nod. Isabella exhaled quietly. Tonight might be one of the safe nights. She had learned to read him the way sailors read weather. "Sit with me," Roland said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "You look pale, sweetheart. Are you eating enough? Or too much? It's so hard to tell with you." He smiled when he said it. That was the thing about Roland. He always smiled. Every cruelty came wrapped in a smile, so gentle you almost doubted your own ears. Isabella smiled back, because that was the price of peace, and she poured him a glass of the Bordeaux he preferred, and she sat down across from him, and she folded her hands in her lap so he wouldn't see them shake. "Now, while Isabella pours that wine and prays for a quiet evening, let me pull you across the street for just a moment." Because Isabella didn't know it. She had no idea, none at all, but she had not been alone in that house for the last 6 months. Not really. Somebody had been watching. The brownstone directly across the street from the Whitmore residence had been sold 6 months earlier in a quiet cash transaction that never appeared in the neighborhood gossip. The buyer was a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The new owner had never once been seen on the front stoop. The curtains on the 3rd floor window stayed drawn during the day and glowed faintly amber at night. The neighbors assumed it was some corporate executive who traveled constantly. The neighbors were wrong. The man who owned that brownstone was named Dante Salvatore, and in the city of Boston, his name was not spoken above a whisper. He was 34 years old. He was the head of the Salvatore Syndicate, a criminal empire his grandfather had built out of the North End docks in the 1950s, and that Dante had expanded, refined, and made unspeakably powerful. He controlled the ports. He controlled half the construction unions. He had judges who took his calls and senators who lost sleep wondering if he had photographs of them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, terrifyingly handsome in the way that made women forget their own names and made men suddenly remember pressing appointments elsewhere. His hair was dark, kept short and neat. His jaw looked like it had been carved out of Carrara marble. And his eyes, obsidian black, patient, endlessly calculating, were the eyes of a man who had never in his adult life looked at another human being without first deciding whether they were useful, obstacle, or prey. 6 months ago, Dante Salvatore had not been watching Isabella Moretti. He had been watching her stepfather, Roland Whitmore, respected Back Bay real estate developer, community pillar, church deacon, had a secret. For nearly a decade, Roland had been laundering money for the O'Brien family, Dante's oldest and most persistent rivals, an Irish syndicate operating out of South Boston that had been trying to muscle into Salvatore territory for 2 generations. Roland's real estate deals were the perfect vehicle. Dirty cash went in one end, clean invoices came out the other, and everyone got rich except the people whose fingerprints were on the guns. Dante had discovered the operation 11 months earlier. He had bought the brownstone across the street 6 months earlier. He had installed listening equipment, telephoto lenses, and 2 of his most patient men on rotating shifts. His plan had been simple, patient, and typical of him. Gather every piece of evidence, then hand Roland Whitmore over to the FBI on a silver platter, gift-wrapped with a bow, and watch the O'Brien family's laundering operation collapse in a single federal indictment. That had been the plan. For the first month, it had been going exactly according to plan. Then Dante had started noticing the girl. She left the house every morning at 4:52. Never 4:51, never 4:53. Dante noticed because Dante noticed everything. She wore a heavy wool coat 2 sizes too big, a knit hat pulled low over her ears, and she walked the 6 blocks to Rossetti's bakery with her head down and her hands stuffed deep in her pockets. She came home at 2 in the afternoon, changed clothes, and walked another 4 blocks to a used bookstore called Corner Chapter, where she worked until 9. She was home by 9:30, every single day, 7 days a week. No friends visited. No phone calls came. No one ever picked her up in a car. She lived like a woman who had already been sentenced. At first, Dante had noted her the way he noted everything. A data point in the file. Stepdaughter. Female. Age approximately 24. Employed 2 service jobs. Non-participant in Whitmore's business. That should have been the end of it. Salvatore men did not concern themselves with civilians who lived in target houses. Civilians were furniture. You worked around them. But then, on a Tuesday in April, Dante had been sitting in the 3rd floor window with a cup of black coffee at 4:52 in the morning, and he had watched Isabella Moretti walk out her front door. And she had stopped just for a second on the top step. She had lifted her face to the pale, gray sky. And Dante, who had killed men without blinking, who had negotiated peace treaties with monsters over glasses of wine, who had not been surprised by another human being in 15 years, Dante had felt something move in his chest that he did not have a name for. She was beautiful. Not in the thin, angular, magazine cover way that Boston society women worked so desperately to achieve. She was beautiful the way old paintings were beautiful. Soft, full, lush, unapologetic. Her body filled her clothes the way a woman's body was meant to. Her curves were generous and womanly and honest. And her face, God, her face, when she lifted it to the sky in that quiet, unguarded moment before the day began, she looked like a woman praying without a church. She looked like a woman waiting for a rescue that had never come. Dante had set his coffee down. He had stared at her until she started walking again. And then he had stood at that window for a very long time, watching the empty street where she had been. That was the first crack. The second crack came 3 weeks later. It was almost midnight. Dante was at the window again. He had started making excuses to be at the window at certain times when he heard it. Not through the reinforced glass. Through the parabolic microphone his men had aimed at the Whitmore kitchen months earlier. A sound. A single sharp sound. The unmistakable, sickening crack of an open palm against a woman's face. And then, 30 seconds later, a smaller sound. A quiet, choked, apologetic sob. Isabella's voice. Saying, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Dante Salvatore, who had once watched a man be dismembered without changing his expression, had gripped the edge of the windowsill so hard the wood had splintered under his hand. He had called his second in command, a granite-faced man named Marco, who had been at Dante's side since they were 15 years old, into the study within the hour. He had ordered a full surveillance escalation. Every room, every window, every phone call, every bank transaction. And he had ordered something else, something Marco had never heard him order in 20 years of service. He had ordered a file, a personal file, on Isabella Moretti. Everything. Her school records, her mother's death certificate, her medical history, her employment, her burned Boston University acceptance letter, which one of Dante's men retrieved a scanned copy of from the university's own archives within 48 hours. Dante read that file in one sitting at his desk with a bottle of bourbon he never opened. He learned that Elena Moretti had been a widow before she married Roland. He learned that Elena had left a life insurance policy of $400,000 in trust for her only daughter, to be released on Isabella's 21st birthday. He learned that on Isabella's 21st birthday, that account had been quietly, illegally emptied by Roland Whitmore, 6 deposits over 16 months, into a laundering vehicle Dante had personally been tracking for a year. He learned that Roland had burned an acceptance letter. He learned that Isabella had been hospitalized once, 18 months ago, for what the intake nurse had discreetly written down as domestic incident, patient uncooperative with reporting. He learned that she had no living relatives, no close friends, no one. Dante had closed the file. He had walked to the window. He had looked across the street at the dark bedroom where Isabella Moretti was, at that very moment, sleeping in a house owned by the man who had stolen her mother's money and used her face as a punching bag for 4 years. And Dante Salvatore, in the quiet of his study, had made a decision that would rewrite the history of the Salvatore family. He was not going to hand Roland Whitmore to the FBI. Not yet. First, he was going to take him apart with his own hands. That decision had been made 5 months ago. Dante had waited, because Dante was a patient man, because Dante knew that rescuing her the wrong way would put her in more danger than leaving her alone. He built his case. He prepared the ground. He moved his pieces. He watched. He waited. His men had begged him 3 separate times to just go get the girl. Marco, who had loved Dante like a brother since they were teenagers, had told him once, quietly, over a bottle of Barolo, "Boss, you're going to wait 1 night too long." Dante had told Marco he would know the night. He would feel it. That night was tonight. Because at 7:04 p.m. on that rainy Thursday in October, sitting in his darkened study with a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand, Dante Salvatore heard through the earpiece connected to the Whitmore kitchen microphone the sound of Roland's voice going soft and cruel and quiet. He heard Roland say, "Where did you find it, sweetheart? Tell me where you found it." He heard Isabella's voice, small and shaking, say in your desk, "It's my mother's account. That's my mother's money, Roland." He heard the scrape of a chair. He heard the sharp inhale of a woman who knew what was coming next. And Dante Salvatore stood up from his desk, set the bourbon down without spilling a drop, and reached for the charcoal suit jacket hanging on the back of his chair. Roland was standing now. He had risen from his chair so slowly, so deliberately, that Isabella had felt the temperature of the room drop 3 degrees before he was fully upright. His pale blue eyes had gone flat. That was the tell she had learned to watch for. When Roland was about to hurt her, his eyes emptied out first, like a house whose lights had all been switched off from the inside. "Say that again," Roland said quietly. "Say that again, Isabella. About your mother's money." "It's mine," she whispered. Her voice was shaking, but she said it. For years of silence, and something in her had finally cracked open, and the words were coming out whether she wanted them to or not. "Mom left it for me, for school. You took it, Roland. You took every dollar, and I want it back." He moved so fast she didn't see the hand until it was already at her throat. He drove her backward against the kitchen island. The edge of the marble bit into her lower spine, and she cried out, and Roland's fingers tightened, and her cry became a wet, strangled sound. Her hands scrabbled at his wrist. Her feet slipped on the tile. She could smell the wine on his breath and the expensive cologne on his collar, and underneath it something rotten. Something she had smelled every night for 4 years, the smell of a man who had convinced himself that hurting her was his right. "You ungrateful little pig," Roland breathed, and his voice was almost tender. "I fed you. I clothed you. I let you live in my house after your mother had the decency to die and leave me with the burden of you. And now you go through my desk? You accuse me? In my own kitchen." Isabella couldn't answer. There was no air. Roland's free hand went to his belt. She heard the click of the buckle. She heard the whisper of leather sliding through wool. And Isabella Moretti, 24 years old, plus size, brilliant, brave, forgotten, closed her eyes and prepared for the 4th year of a life she had begun to believe she would not survive. She never heard the front door. She heard, instead, an impossible sound. A sound that did not belong in the physical world she had lived in for 4 years. The sound of solid oak splintering. The sound of iron hinges being ripped from a 200-year-old frame. The sound of the front door of the Whitmore brownstone coming off the wall, as if it had been made of paper. Roland's hand loosened on her throat. He turned his head, and Isabella slumped against the kitchen island, sucking in her first ragged breath, opened her eyes just in time to see a man walk into her kitchen. He did not run. He did not shout. He walked, slow, unhurried, silent, the way a wolf walks into a clearing where it already knows the deer cannot escape. He was tall. He filled the doorway. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way a second skin fits a body, and a black shirt open at the collar. And his dark hair was damp from rain, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were the blackest, quietest, most terrifying thing Isabella had ever seen in her life. They were not angry. That was what made them terrible. They were calm. They were the eyes of a man who had already decided exactly what he was going to do, and was simply here to do it. Roland released Isabella's throat. She slid down the side of the island onto the tile, gasping, one hand at her neck. "Who the hell are you?" Roland demanded, and Isabella heard, for the first time in 4 years, a small crack of fear inside her stepfather's voice. The man in the doorway did not answer him. He was not looking at Roland. He was looking at her. He crossed the kitchen in 5 long strides, and Roland, who had beaten a grown woman 30 seconds earlier, stepped backward against the wall like a child. The man dropped to one knee in front of Isabella. His $1,000 suit hit the wet tile without hesitation. His hand, enormous, warm, unbelievably gentle, cupped the side of her face and tilted her chin up so he could see her throat. "Bella," he said. Just that. Just her name, in a voice like dark velvet. "Can you breathe?" She nodded. She couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down her face, and she couldn't stop them. "Good girl," he murmured. His thumb brushed once, softly, across her cheekbone. Then his face changed. The gentleness did not leave his eyes when he looked at her. It simply, quietly, in the space of one breath, refused to travel with him when he turned his head toward Roland Whitmore. What Roland saw when those obsidian eyes finally landed on him was something Roland had not seen in 52 years of a comfortable, cruel, unpunished life. Roland Whitmore saw death, and death was patient, and death had already made itself at home in his kitchen. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked Roland quietly. Roland's mouth opened. His mouth closed. He looked at the shattered doorframe. He looked at the size of the man kneeling beside his stepdaughter. He looked at the black leather gloves the man had not bothered to remove. "I asked you a question, Roland." The voice never rose. "Do you know who I am?" "S. Salvatore," Roland whispered. "Very good." The man rose to his full height. He was easily 6'3". "Dante Salvatore. And you have been laundering money for the O'Briens for 9 years, Roland. I have your bank records. I have your invoices. I have the shell corporations in Delaware and the offshore accounts in Nevis, and the wire transfers to a bagman in Southey named Fitzgerald. I have enough on you to put you in a federal cell until you die of old age." Roland's face had gone the color of old paper. "But that isn't why I'm here tonight," Dante said softly. "I have known about your money for 11 months, Roland. I could have taken you any night. I chose tonight for a different reason." He looked down at Isabella, still on the floor, and his eyes softened again for one brief moment. Then they went back to Roland, and this time they did not soften. "I have listened to you hurt this woman for 6 months, Dante said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter than a whisper, and Roland began, visibly, to shake. 6 months of audio, Roland. Every scream, every apology she made to you for bruises you put on her body. I have photographs of what you did to her in September. I have a hospital record from 18 months ago that a very brave nurse tried to file and that you had buried. I know about the acceptance letter. I know about her mother's $400,000. I know about the belt in your hand." Roland looked down. He was still holding the belt. He dropped it as if it had burned him. "Please," Roland whispered. Dante smiled. It was the smile Isabella would remember for the rest of her life. "Oh, Roland," he said gently, "you are going to be saying that word for a very, very long time. Before I take you into the final chapter of Isabella's story tonight, do me one last favor. Hit that like button if this story is moving you. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this again, and let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. Now, back to that kitchen. Roland Whitmore's knees hit the tile floor. Not by choice. Dante Salvatore had not touched him. Roland's knees had simply given out, the way a man's body gives out when it finally understands that the 4 years of unpunished cruelty have arrived. at last at the door. Isabella watched from the floor as her stepfather, the pillar of the community, the deacon of St. Cecilia's, the man who had burned her acceptance letter and stolen her mother's money and put his hands on her throat 2 minutes ago, began to weep like a child. Dante did not look at him. He turned away from Roland, as if Roland had already stopped existing. He crouched again in front of Isabella, and this time he lifted her gently into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and Isabella, who had spent for years being told she was too heavy, too much, too big to be worth carrying, buried her face against the shoulder of his charcoal suit and shook. "Marco," Dante said quietly. She had not heard the second man enter, but he was there suddenly in the doorway, granite-faced, older than Dante by 10 years, dressed in black. "Boss, take him downstairs. The basement of the brownstone across the street. I'll deal with him personally in the morning. Tonight I have somewhere to be." Understood. Isabella did not see them take Roland out. Dante had already turned her face gently against his neck so she wouldn't have to. She only heard the shuffle of feet, the small pathetic sound of a grown man begging, and then the front door, what was left of it, closing behind them. And then the house was quiet. For the first time in 4 years, the house was quiet, and Isabella Moretti was in it, and she was safe. Dante carried her out into the rain. There was a black armored SUV waiting at the curb, and a driver holding the door open, and a heated leather seat waiting for her, and a cashmere blanket already folded across the console. He had prepared everything. He had known he was coming for her tonight, before Isabella had known there was such a thing as being rescued. She woke the next morning in a bed that felt like it was made of clouds. Silk sheets. A view of the Boston skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Fresh flowers on the nightstand. White peonies, her mother's favorite, though she could not imagine how he had known. A private doctor had come and gone in the night. Her ribs were taped. The cut above her eyebrow was stitched. And on the chair beside the bed, folded neatly, was a soft burgundy cashmere robe cut for her exact size. Dante entered with a tray. Coffee, exactly the way she took it at Rossetti's. A warm croissant. A small handwritten card in sharp, elegant script that simply read, "You are safe. You are home. Take your time." He set the tray down. He sat in the chair across from the bed, not on it, giving her space. And when Isabella found her voice, cracked and small, and asked him why any of this, why a man like him had crossed a street for a woman like her, Dante Salvatore leaned forward, and his obsidian eyes were soft, and he told her the truth. He told her he had watched her walk to the bakery every morning for 6 months. He told her he had learned her coffee order from the barista at Rossetti's by leaving $100 tips. He told her he had read every page of her burned acceptance letter and had already funded a full scholarship in her name at Boston University, waiting for her signature. He told her the $400,000 her mother had left her was already back in her name, with 4 years of interest, deposited that morning. He told her the deed to the Back Bay brownstone was in a folder on the kitchen counter, signed over to her, because a house that had held her captive was going to belong to her now, and she could burn it down or live in it or sell it. And it was her choice, only her choice, for the first time in 4 years. And when Isabella began to cry, really cry, the way a person cries when they finally understand they're not going to be hit again, Dante Salvatore did something no one had ever seen the most feared man in Boston do. He got down on one knee beside her bed. He took her hand, and he pressed his forehead against her knuckles like a man in a cathedral. "I am not a good man, Bella Mia," he said quietly. "I have done things you should never know about. I will not lie to you about what I am. But I swear to you, on my mother's grave, on my family's name, on every breath in my body, you will never sleep in fear again. Not one more night. Not one more hour. Not while I am alive." Roland Whitmore was arrested by the FBI on a Monday. The evidence file that landed on the federal prosecutor's desk was so complete, so meticulously organized, that the assistant U.S. attorney handling the case called it the cleanest laundering indictment of her career. Roland was denied bail. The O'Brien family, furious that their bagman had brought federal heat down on their operation, quietly let it be known through certain channels that Roland Whitmore would not be safe in general population. Roland was placed in protective custody. Roland began within a month, to age 10 years for every week he sat in that cell. Isabella Moretti enrolled at Boston University the following January. She took her mother's maiden name back. She moved into the brownstone she had grown up in, fully renovated, filled with light, every room repainted, every piece of Roland's furniture donated or burned. She kept her job at Rossetti's bakery 2 mornings a week, not because she needed the money, but because Mrs. Rossetti had cried when Isabella tried to quit, and because the smell of fresh bread at 5 a.m. reminded her that she was still here, still walking, still free. And every evening, at 7 o'clock, a black armored SUV pulled up to her front curb, and the most feared man in Boston stepped out in a bespoke charcoal suit and walked up her steps, and he never once knocked on her door without knowing she wanted him to. 6 months later, on a warm night in April, standing on the balcony of Dante's penthouse with the city glittering below and his suit jacket around her shoulders, Isabella turned to the man who had broken down her door on the worst night of her life and told him she loved him. Dante Salvatore, who had killed men without blinking, who had built empires and burned rivals, and never in his adult life said those 3 words to another human being. Dante Salvatore closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against hers and whispered them back like a prayer. He kissed her under the Boston sky, not roughly, reverently, like a man who had spent his whole life waiting for permission to kneel. For years of silence, for years of bruises, for years of a house that looked perfect from the street and felt like a coffin from the inside. And in the end, the girl the world had tried to forget became the queen of the city that had never seen her, because a man in a charcoal suit had crossed a rainy street, torn a door off its hinges, and refused to let her spend one more night alone. If Isabella's story moved you tonight, please do 3 small things for me before you go. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one, and drop your city in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're listening from. I read every single one, and every single one matters. I'll see you in the next story.